Chapter 24. Partners Again. Prue! It had sounded initially like the hoot of an owl. Prue's focus was so intent on her front wheel and the navigation of a particularly rough section of the road that she'd ignored the sound as being just another note in the unending symphony that was the forest's many noises. But it came again, louder, closer. Prue! It was, undoubtedly, someone calling her name. She looked up and saw, standing in the middle of the road, a short figure wearing a dirty brigadier's uniform. The figure had the hair and spectacles of Curtis, but her reasoning refused to allow her to believe it. As she came closer, however, the fact was indisputable. Curtis was not home in St. John's. Curtis was not safe with his parents. Curtis had not left Wildwood. Curtis was standing right in front of her, and she was about to run him over. "Curtis!" she hollered as her fingers mangled her bicycle brakes and the back tires skidded and swerved against the dirt of the road. The wagon kicked up violently from behind and slammed back down onto the ground with a tremendous whang. Curtis leapt out of the way, diving headlong into the brush by the side of the road. Coming to a sliding stop, she jammed the kickstand down with her heel and vaulted from the seat, running to where Curtis had landed. "Curtis!" she cried. "I can't believe it! I can't believe it!" Curtis was pulling himself from a small shroud of raspberries, the stickers clinging tenaciously to his uniform. She threw out her hand and he accepted it. Together, they stood on the side of the road, staring at each other in amazement. They both began to speak at the same time. How did you... Unable to get a word in, they let out a unified holler of joy and fell into a long, happy hug. Emerging from the embrace, Prue was the first to speak. "I thought you'd gone home. That woman, Alexandra, said so." Curtis shook his head. "No, I was in the Warren when you were there. I was locked up." Prue cursed, her face pinched in anger. "That evil, evil lady! I can't believe that. All the lies she told—" "But you," interjected Curtis. "They said you had gone home." "I did," explained Prue. "But I turned around and came right back." "Oh, Curtis, so much has happened since I saw you last. I can't even begin to explain." Curtis slapped his palm against his chest in excitement. "Me too. You wouldn't believe it." "But I don't have much time," said Prue, remembering her charge. "I'm riding ahead of the Northwood Army. I have to get help." "The Northwood Army?" asked Curtis. "What's that?" "Not really an army," Prue corrected herself. "More like a few hundred farmers and pitchforks. I'm riding ahead to try and get help from the Wildwood bandits. I figured with their help we stand a chance." Curtis smiled. "What?" asked Prue. "What are you smiling about?" "You found them," he said. "What?" "You found them, the bandits. You happened to be looking at a Wildwood bandit, signed and sworn," said Curtis proudly, his arms at his hips. "You? You're a bandit now?" She threw her hand to her forehead. "Yep," continued to Curtis. "The whole bandit band is right behind—" He swiveled as he spoke, but was stopped short to see that the road behind him was empty. "They were just there." "Hang on," he said, holding a finger in the air. "I'll be right back." He turned and began jogging down the long road, the gold fringe on his shoulders swinging. When he'd arrived at the bend of the road, he stood on the forest's edge and yelled something into the trees. After a moment, a figure appeared. They spoke briefly, and the figure disappeared back into the tree line. Curtis turned to Prue and waved his hand in a circle, rolling his eyes. Suddenly, the dark green underbrush gave way, and dozens of armed men and women, dressed in an array of ragtag uniforms, stepped from the shadows onto the clearing of the road. A man Prue recognized to be Brendan walked to the front of the crowd, and with Curtis walking alongside, they approached Prue as she stood, speechless on her bike. "Prue, this is Brendan the Bandit King," said Curtis when the band of bandits came close. "I believe you two have met?" "We have!" shouted Prue, making a slight, embarrassed bow. "Oh, Brendan, I'm happy to see you're okay." Brendan smiled. "How are your ribs, outsider?" he asked. "Fine, thanks. Much better." Prue scanned the crowd of gathering bandits. Their number was fewer than she'd anticipated. Apparently her face said as much. because Brendan spoke up in explanation, his face suddenly sullen.
Our numbers have been decimated. We're not the band you encountered when last you fell into our midst. But no matter. You found us on the march to confront the Dowager Governess once and for all. We plan on giving her the hiding of a lifetime, even if we die trying.
The crowd behind the king murmured in resounding approval. But listen, Brendan, said Curtis, his voice quaking in excitement. Prue has an army too.
What?
Prue stared at Prue. Sorry, Brendan stared at Prue. Prue took a deep breath. Since I saw you last, I went to the Northwood and spoke to the mystics there. They've agreed to help, to fight the governess. They've called their militia together. The whole country of Northwood is mustering to defend the wood. They're on their way now. They can't be far behind me. I rode ahead to find you, the bandits, in hopes that you'd join us. A collective noise erupted from the gathering bandits. Allies, one shouted. Our number grows. Another reprimanded the first. Those bumpkins, are you kidding me? No bandit has fought alongside a civilian. That's unthinkable. Brendan turned and waved his arms in the air, attempting to quiet the unruly bunch. Shut it, all of you, he commanded. When the band had quieted, he turned back to Prue. What kind of army are you talking about? 400, said Prue. Give or take. Humans and animals. Armed with farm implements, mostly. Ah, boy, remarked one bandit from the middle of the crowd, who was immediately shushed by his neighbors. Brendan chewed on the information. Not ideal, but the measure of a fighter is in his skill, not his weapon, he said, stroking the coarse hair of his red beard. An old bandit adage goes, a bell is a cup until it's struck. He turned to the amassed bandit crowd and called for their attention. We will fight alongside the farmers, he said, and the crowd exploded into objection. We steal from them. We don't fight with them. My granddad would be spinning in his grave to know that a daughter of his would be fighting alongside a Northwooder. Quiet, shouted Brendan. I'll take no objections. I didn't call for a vote on this matter. It's final. Once the bandits had ceased their clamor, he continued. The creed and code of the bandits clearly states to hold all plants, animals, and humans as equal. Never in the history of our band have these words rung more true. His voice grew steely and hard as he pointed a tattooed finger in the direction of the woods. This threat we face is shared by every living thing in the woods. By allying with Northwood in this fight, we not only uphold our code, we make it stronger. Stronger by living it. He eyed the crowd. Is that clear? He was met by silence. I said, is that clear? He repeated, his voice ringing out through the narrow clearing of the road. Aye, said a bandit. A few more fell in as well. Aye, King. Finally, the entire crowd chorused their approval, and Brendan nodded. He turned to Prue. Okay, girl, take me to this army of yours. Prue had pedaled her bike to the northernmost plank of the bridge, and, resting its frame against the railing, had hopped off and was currently pacing the distance between the two columns. Occasionally, she would look sidelong at the farthest point of the road, hoping that soon a few shapes would appear out of the hazy distance. Perhaps the ears of a rabbit, or the arched roof of a caravan that would be the harbinger of the arriving army. But so far, the road remained empty. The entire bandit band occupied the span of the bridge. They'd arrived sprightly and full of vigor, but the time that had elapsed between their arrival and the current moment had drained their energies. They meandered the boards of the bridge aimlessly, and Prue was hyper-conscious of their eyes as they looked to her for direction. Curtis mirrored her steps as she paced. They would meet each other at the halfway point and share a look. The darkness of the deep ravine spilled out below them. Brendan leaned against the railing, a weed protruding from his lips. He chewed on it thoughtfully as he spoke. Prue, he said, we can't afford much more time. Prue stopped her pacing. She glanced back down the long road. It remained, as ever, empty. I don't know, she said fretfully. I didn't think they'd be this far behind.
And you know for certain this army was being gathered?
Asked Brendan. I swear, said Prue. I was there when the instructions were given. The elder mystic, she told me to go, to find you, and she said meet here on this bridge. Dang it all! She stomped her foot, hearing the sole of her shoe echo against the wooden plank. Brendan looked away, over at the milling band of bandits. Several of them had their weapons out, pistols, rifles, and cutlasses, and were engaged in a kind of time-killing inspection.
We've got to move, he said. If we stop this woman, if we're going to, the time is fast approaching.
Sir, one of the bandits called, squinting in the distance. Them Northwooders, here they come. Both Brendan and Prue jerked their heads in the direction the bandit had been staring. Sure enough, far off around a bend, the first few figures were appearing. They walked in a loose formation, and what first seemed to be scattered groups of marchers soon grew until the wide expanse of the long road was filled from side to side with an ocean of creatures. There were rabbits, humans, foxes, and bears, each wearing the dirty and worn costume of farm laborers. Coveralls, overalls, button-down gingham shirts, and plaid flannels. In their hands and paws they carried every known farm implement under the sun, and they walked with a kind of gritty determination Prue hadn't anticipated. The crowd was broken here and there by the presence of ox and donkey-drawn carriages, their bright paint jobs a striking contrast against the background of the forest's million shades of green. Prue recognized Sterling the fox at the head of the marching crowd. She smiled widely when she saw him. You made it, she said, relieved as the crowd came closer. Sterling extended his palm in greeting. It took some doing, yes, but here we are. She turned to Curtis. Sterling, this is my good friend Curtis. He's a bandit. Curtis made a low bow. How do you do? He said. Sterling looked at him suspiciously. Are you their leader? He asked, his eyes falling over the gathered band of milling bandits. Oh, no, said Curtis, stepping away. That'd be Brendan, the bandit king. Brendan walked forward, his hands resting on the pommel of his saber. His chin was held high, his crown of salal vines tangled dramatically in his curly red hair. Hello, Fox, said Brendan. Sterling puffed up his chest at the arrival of the bandit. His eyes widened. Hello, Brendan, he said. Didn't think I'd be seeing your wretched face again. Alarmed, Prue looked at Curtis, who only shrugged. Brendan smiled. Funny circumstance, to be sure, but it's all water under the bridge at this point. Right, Foxy? I'm of a mind to arrest you right here and now, said Sterling, for all you've done. Prue stepped forward. Arrest him? Are you crazy? We're allies, remember? The fox glared at Prue. You did not say anything about this psychopath being involved. He pointed a jagged claw at the bandit king, his teeth bared. This man is responsible for more shipments of product lost than any single bandit in the wood. He is a wanted man in all 4 countries. I personally have put my share of a season's harvest up as a reward for his capture, dead or alive. He looked back at Brendan. Last time we met, you were lucky to get away with your life. I intend to be more thorough this time. Oh, come on, Fox, said Brendan demurely. Let's not quibble over administrative details. Bigger things are afoot. Sterling was fuming. The thick red fur on his face seemed to take on a deeper hue as his eyes narrowed. His hand went to the pruning shears at his side. He began to draw them from their sheath. Okay, Foxy, Brendan said. If you must. The silvery blade of his saber started to emerge from his scabbard. Make your move, Constable. A voice erupted from the crowd of farmers behind the fox. Stop this, came the voice. Prue turned to see Iphigenia, the elder mystic, shoving her way through the crowd. Arriving at the bridge, she put her wizened hand on the fox's arm. Constable Fox, I command you to stop this nonsense. Brendan hadn't moved, his hand still positioned on his sword.
Listen to the old lady, Fox,
he said. The fox's hackles rose, a bright spine of fur jutting up from the back of his neck. You too, son, Iphigenia said, looking at the bandit king. She walked forward and put her hands on top of Brendan's, shoving the emerging sword hilt back into its scabbard. Having stayed the two combatants, Iphigenia stepped back and eyed the group warily. Sorry we didn't make it sooner, dear, she said to Prue. These old bones don't move as fast as they used to. No big deal, Prue said, exhaling a deep, relieved sigh. I'm just glad to see you all. Iphigenia smiled before raising her head and squinting up at the sky. The two armies squared off silently as the elder mystic gauged the position of the sun. Satisfied, she looked back at Brendan. King, she said, we offer our services. We are a humble army, but what we lack in arms we make up for in number. We have 500 strong here, farmers and ranchers, and all are very able with scythe and pitchfork. If you march with us, I think we shall have a formidable force. Brendan's face had softened in the presence of the mystic. His hand fell away from the pommel of his sword, and he bowed deeply to the old woman.
If you'll have us, he said, we'd be honored.
No need to bow, King, Iphigenia said, blushing. I understand your people's creed. She turned to face the gathering farmers. People of Northwood, listen closely. Today on this bridge, an alliance has been struck, albeit temporarily. Today we march with the bandits of Wildwood for our common good. We go as allies. Turning to Sterling the Fox. Now I would appreciate it, for the sake of our enterprise, if you would shake hands in good faith with the bandit king. The fox grumbled something under his breath before turning to Brendan. Very well, he said. It's for the good of our enterprise. He held out his paw. Brendan took it readily and shook it. When a few shakes had transpired, the fox jerked his paw away and nodded gravely. It's done.
Okay, bandits,
Brendan said loudly.
We march with the Northwooders.
Prue saw Iphigenia exhale a deep breath. She reached over and grabbed Prue's hand, saying, Our little plan is working. Let's hope our good fortune holds out, too. Prue smiled. Let's. Curtis sidled up next to Prue and reached out his hand. Hi, he said earnestly. I'm Curtis. I'm Prue's friend. I'm a bandit, too. Iphigenia turned to Curtis and began to smile politely when a look of surprise appeared on her face. Well, that's quite a coincidence. Prue and Curtis exchanged glances. What's a coincidence? Asked Curtis. Another half-breed, explained Iphigenia, gripping his hand. Having only ever seen a few in my lifetime, it is quite remarkable to meet two in the span of a day. Prue was speechless. Curtis looked back and forth between Prue and the mystic. What does that mean, half-breed? He asked. Iphigenia reached up and patted him on the cheek. No time for idle chit-chat, she said, turning away into the crowd of farmers. We have work to do. The long wooden suspension bridge creaked noisily as the army crossed over the creek's ravine, and Alexandra's horse whinnied, reluctant to set his hoof on the first boards of the bridge. Shh, quieted the dowager, patting his thick neck. She urged him forward with a swift kick of her heels against his flank. The baby murmured in her arms. The crossing was slow. The bridge swayed under the weight of the line of bodies it supported. Once on the other side, Alexandra cantered the horse up the hill to monitor the rest of the army's crossing. The cannon teams were forced to cross on their own, so great was the weight of their munitions. Groups of 4 soldiers apiece slowly pushed the great metal behemoths across the complaining boards of the suspension bridge. Alexandra was impatient. She glanced up at the gloomy sky. The sun was slowly approaching its highest point. Noon was only a few hours away. She eyed the ravine that the creek had cut through the hillside. "Captain!" she hollered. A coyote ran to her side. He wore a peaked mitre cap, and his uniform was deep scarlet. He saluted as he approached. "Send a sentry team up the north side of the creek," she commanded. "We should establish a perimeter on the north side of the grove. I don't want any surprises. I will need all of my energies about me to weave the incantation." "Yes, Madam Governess," replied the captain, and he jogged off to organize a troop. Alexandra watched the last of the artillery team make their way gingerly to the other side of the bridge. When the army was amassed in the road, Alexandra called for attention. "Here's where we leave the road," she commanded. "Into the woods. Follow me." "Of woods magic?" asked Curtis, still perplexed. "I just don't know what that means." The conjoined armies of the bandits and the Northwood farmers marched in single file up the long, winding path that was the game trail as it snaked along a steep hillside. Curtis walked close behind Prue and her bike, peppering her with questions. "I've told you everything I know, Curtis," said Prue. "It's something called woods magic. It just means that, you're kind of from here or something." "And you're of woods magic? How?" he asked. "I told you. Alexandra made it possible for my parents to have kids," she said, exasperated. "So that makes me of woods magic, I guess." Curtis shook his head in disbelief. I just don't know how that would be possible. We didn't even move here until I was 5. "Search your brain," offered Prue. "Do you have any strange relatives? Maybe one of them came from the wood." "I guess my Aunt Ruthie's always been a little weird," Curtis surmised. "She lives right on the edge of the impassable wilderness, the wood, and she really keeps to herself. My parents say she's just a little batty." Curtis, in this haze of concentration, had neglected to keep pace with the rest of the marching column. One of the farmers, a black bear armed with a pair of shears, grunted angrily when Curtis fell back and nearly tripped over the bear's massive forepaws. "Sorry." "Just watch where you're going," growled the bear. Curtis jogged to catch up with Prue as she continued to push her bike and wagon up the steep incline of the path. "Well, there you go," said Prue. "Your old Aunt Ruthie." "I don't know," said Curtis, shaking his head. "Come to think of it, most of my relatives would fit that description. A little batty." Suddenly, a whisper began cascading down the line of marchers. "Shh, shh, shh." A wave of an arm followed, passed from soldier to soldier, instructing the marchers to get down on the ground. Curtis waved to the black bear behind him, passing on the command, as he and Prue eased themselves quietly to the ground. "What's up?" he whispered to Prue. "I don't know," she responded. Prue slowly, silently laid her bike against the slope of the hill. She tapped the soldier in front of her, a female bandit in a muddy blue uniform with a thick coil of rope across her back. "What's going on?" The bandit shrugged, crouched low amid the sword ferns that dangled over the small clearing of the trail. After a moment, more information was passed down the line in a series of whispers. The bandit, receiving the intel, turned to Prue. "Coyotes," she whispered, "on the far ridge." Prue looked over at the other side of the ravine. The ample vegetation spilled down the side of the hill, falling to an empty creek bed where the two slopes met in a deep V. "Where?" she whispered. "I don't see anything." Curtis was searching the far hillside as well. Finally, the crack of a broken tree limb in the bracken announced the approach of their enemy. Within moments, the woods seemed to disgorge a troop of 30 or so coyote soldiers, their heads barely above the massive copse of maidenhair fern that surrounded them. The going was tough. They laboriously made their way along the hillside slope. Prue looked up the long line of crouched bandits and farmers, searching for some sort of guidance. She saw Brendan's head emerge from the line. He was gesturing to a few of his fellow bandits at the front of the column. The hand signals he made were indecipherable to Prue, but the bandits to whom they'd been directed nodded quickly in understanding. Walking crouched, he made his way down the line toward Prue and Curtis, stopping at the bandit in front of Prue. He made a kind of curlicue motion with his index finger and pointed across the ravine. The bandit nodded sharply and pulled the coil of rope from her shoulder.
"What's the plan?"
hissed Curtis from behind Prue.
"Can we do anything?"
Brendan shook his head.
"Sit tight,"
he whispered.
"Just archers and grapplers for this job."
"You've got a sling?" suggested Curtis. Brendan looked at him blankly.
"Ever use one before?"
he asked. "No," said Curtis.
"Like I said, archers and grapplers only. Hold your position."
Minutes passed. The coyotes on the other side of the ravine, unaware of the danger that lurked on the opposite bank of the ferns, continued their cautious march along the ridge. The bandits in the hidden line on the game trail watched for the sign from Brendan. Suddenly, the wind shifted and swept down the hillside above the hidden army. One of the coyotes, the jangling metals at his breast suggesting a superior rank, held his muzzle high, sniffing the air. His eyes widened as he caught their scent. "Enemies!" he shouted, whipping a saber from his hip. "On the far ridge!" No sooner had he voiced this warning than Brendan gave the signal from the front of the line. About 20 bandits, in various places along the column, stood up and prepared for action. Half the bandits juggled coils of rope topped with grappling hooks in their hands, while others drew back the string of tall yew bows and took careful aim at the opposing ridge. "Archers, now!" shouted Brendan, and the air above the ravine became an aerial show of flying arrow shafts. Several of the arrows found their mark, and dozens of fern stands were mowed low by the coyotes, tumbling lifelessly down the hillside. In that instant, the troop of coyotes was easily halved in number, and the ones that remained began yapping in panic. "Hold the line!" barked the coyote captain, still standing with his saber drawn. "Fusiliers, fire at will!" The soldiers to whom the command had been directed began desperately fumbling with their long flintlock rifles, jamming powder and ball down the iron barrel. The bandits let loose another fleet of arrows, and the few poor coyotes who had not found cover fell under the barrage before any of their rifle shots were fired. The captain remained standing, defiantly glaring at the opposite ridge. "Retreat!" he called back. "Back for reinforcements!" Brendan seized the moment to signal his grapplers to throw. The ridge in an instant became crisscrossed with taut rope lines as the barbs of the grappling hooks found purchase in the overhanging tree boughs. The bandit in front of Prue had thrown a line, and, testing its strength momentarily, she leapt into the air and sailed across the gully with the fluid ease of an acrobat. Prue watched as she arrived on the other side, and, drawing her saber, quickly dispatched 3 coyotes with a series of lightning-fast maneuvers. Along the ridge, several more grapplers had swung the distance between the ridge and were engaged in heated battle. The coyote captain, enraged at how quickly his troop had been defeated, gave a quick, angry bark to the bandits and farmers on the far ridge, sheathing his weapon, and turning to run. Curtis was the first to witness the captain's retreat, and he quickly pulled the sling rope from his belt and began setting a rock in the sling's cradle. I got him," he said. Prue looked at him sideways. Curtis squinted one eye and began carefully swinging the sling, feeling the weight of the stone arc the sling assembly into a whipping circle around his shoulder. He gauged the distance between himself and the uniformed coyote, who was now disappearing into the underbrush, his hat bouncing just below the lowest hanging branches. Before his navy blue uniform had vanished, however, Curtis gave a great yelp and let loose the sling. Time seemed to slow to a stop. Curtis watched the stone as it flew into the air above the creek, and followed it with his eyes as it fell with a mighty plop into the creek bed below. He looked back up, crestfallen, to bear witness to the captain's escape into the underbrush. Suddenly, he heard an arrow whistle across the ravine and land with a dead thunk in the captain's back. The coyote fell, disappearing into the deep green brush with a crash. Curtis looked up the line of figures to see Brendan standing with his bow drawn, the string still quivering from the released arrow. He glanced back at Curtis and smiled. Curtis felt his face flush red. Brendan turned and eyed the far ridge, inspecting the terrain for stragglers, but all was quiet. Satisfied, he waved for the column of marchers to continue up the trail. "Nice shot," whispered Prue over her shoulder. "Let's try and see you do it," snapped Curtis.